A warm welcome to everybody. This is our 101st happy hour. For those of you who weren't able to join our centenary celebrations this last week, we continue with our 101st, looking specifically around healthy aging, happy homes and happy cities. And the theme there runs through about how do we create better living homes, places, neighbourhoods for our communities, and something that's very much at the heart of the HAPPI, our Housing Our Aging Population Panel for Innovation programme in England, but also we're going to draw on some of the learning from the Healthy Aging Challenge from the UKRI Innovate UK programme, and also a bit of examples of how happy cities and happy towns are taking place both in the UK, and delighted also to invite a speaker from Canada. So our agenda is as follows. We're going to kick off in a moment with George McGuinness, the Challenge Director at the former Healthy Aging Challenge, a programme that I had the privilege to be on the advisory board. And George, I think the programme really delivered a big punch, and we look forward to sort of some of the lessons and learning from that. Kevin actually was one of the original commissioners of the then HAPPI report many moons ago, and now is the director of a Healthy Newtown programme in Ebbsfleet in southeast England, and we'll learn a little bit about that, but also reflect on how that Healthy Newtown programme can also help inform the development of the current government's plans around housing generally, but also the development of new towns and the renaissance of new towns here in England. And then, as I mentioned, we're also delighted for Madeleine Ebert to join us. Good morning to you, Madeleine, in Canada and Vancouver. And you're a senior housing specialist and architect by background, working on a really exciting program that I've been following on social media for some months now, called Happy Cities. So I hope everybody can see that we're sort of segueing across healthy places, happy homes, and happy cities. And to kick us off is George. So, George, welcome, and look forward to hearing from you.
Jeremy, thank you very much. As ever, it's a real pleasure to join HousingLIN and Happy Hour, and particularly to be able to talk about our work over the last 5 years. So a reminder, I suppose, first about what the Healthy Aging Challenge was about. We were guided by this vision, and I highlight in particular the bit about as they age, because it actually meant our focus was quite broad, not just on what people often just refer to as older people in the twilight of their lives, but a much broader demographic of people in work, in retirement, etc. And to deliver this work, we worked with the Centre for Aging Better to identify what became 7 themes that guided what we did. And they're sort of shown here. And I've noticed that 2 of those themes specifically cover the built environment, with designing of homes and creating healthy, active places. But actually, the built environment is part of and is influenced by a lot of the other work that we did, so none of these things stood alone. So what does running a challenge like this actually involve? So it was an integrated program of research and business innovation, which we designed as supporting the development of a pipeline of innovations going from research and spin out right through to scale up. And I'm going to paint a little bit more of a picture later of examples on this journey. And on reflection, we believe that this challenge-led approach has worked with impacts that have achieved across, rather against a background of, as you'll remember, a global pandemic and a cost of living crisis, amongst other things. And we think it's galvanized what we thought was in the UK as a nascent healthy aging domain that spans many sectors and catalyzed a movement needed to transform essentially how we live, work, and care for one another. And I think really interesting, on the way we were able to open up new avenues for collaboration between innovators from a wide range of industries and academics, and particularly academics from disciplines not normally associated with the innovation process, those from the arts, humanities, and social sciences. And what you see on the chart is just a sort of snapshot of some of the things that have gone on within that portfolio. So within, I suppose, the 98 million of the challenge funding, 18 million has been invested in projects specifically related to housing. And they've all been sort of co-designed with those with lived experience and provide products and services which enable those older adults to stay living independently and engaged in their communities. Let me just stop and reflect that for a minute. I'm an engineer by background. I've done a little bit of building stuff. I think when I set off, I thought, well, the built environment costs a lot of money, takes a long time to build new things. How would we have impact? And I was really surprised actually by how much this came through as a really, really strong theme in what we were doing. So let's sort of look at some examples, and I'll work through from the early stage research through to scale up, so using the diagram. So first example, a research project designing homes for healthy cognitive aging, run by Stirling University, was identifying scalable and sustainable design improvements to homes, and they worked with businesses such as IKEA and Blackwood Homes, who Jeremy mentioned, to inform future dementia, I'm going to call them dementia friendly, but certainly dementia accessible designs of housing. Maybe that's one example of research that you would associate with the housing environment, but just to say that required an awful lot of healthcare expertise and sort of social science to back up the sort of architectural design component to it. And then thinking about the business innovations, I talked about Spin Out. One of our very early projects was run actually by Professor Jones up at Northumbria University, who was working with Southseaham Garden Village to come up with a concept for flexible living to age in place. And that was being built into the new Southseaham Garden Village as things were going on. And he's taken that further, again, a toolkit essentially for how to design places and some quite innovative thinking about the layout of the housing. So what do I mean by helping entrepreneurs on their journey? That's probably more traditional fare for an innovation agency. The example that I'll give, circadian lighting, were funded to develop the novel lighting and monitoring tool to support those living with dementia. So not just circadian lighting, but actually the lighting fittings were fitted with sensors so they can understand what's going on and feed that into an intelligent system to respond. And actually, there was a huge range of innovations in this space. So in other examples, we funded Accenture working with Harvard Housing on a smart solution for housing wardens to address social isolation, and another project, a different organisation in Wales working on co-housing. So that gives you a sort of a flavour for the building range of sorts of innovation and some of the tools that go with it. And then at the top end of the scale is what Jeremy mentioned, Blackwood's Peoplehood Project, which aiming to enable people to live independently with a new design for accessible housing being built into a development near Dundee, now completed, and supported by a range of placemaking innovations aimed at fostering a thriving community. And when we talk about tools again, one of the things that I probably least understood when I remember the interviews for Blackwood's pitch right at the very beginning was the significance of their design guide. But that essentially is not just a tool for them, but is a tool that they've been using to engage the Scottish Government over future standards for accessible housing design. So you can begin to see the range of impacts coming through the work. And then to build on the topic for today, we clearly recognise that actually there was a whole dimension to planning that we hadn't yet really put our finger on, and Jeremy sort of very helpfully sort of highlighted where we could make a difference. It coincided with the government establishing the Older Persons Housing Task Force, just to look at that question of what's the right mix of housing and how do planners in local areas make the right choices. And so we funded actually the HousingLIN to work with Ipsos and others to do a piece of research that would come up with a really strong evidence base for what people want and build that into a tool that helps planners come up with a decision on the right mix of housing for future. And I'm sure others in the HousingLIN will talk much more eloquently about this than I ever could. But that gives you a sort of flavour of what we've been able to do over the last 5 years to sort of energise the market. I should say I'm really excited that, because building on a recognition of what we've achieved, I've moved into a role called Healthy Lives, which continues and expands the work that we've been doing. Clearly, we're going through, planning with a new government and some budget things in the UK right now. But that's a recognition of the value of this area. And just in closing, I would really like to pay tribute to the work of the HousingLIN and particularly to what Jeremy has done as a member of our advisory group, helping us through some really sticky situations. So thank you, and back over to you, Jeremy.
Well, George, I think you deserve the credit rather than me, but I'm really pleased that you drew attention to the Older Persons Housing Task Force as well, because there are some really great parallels there. And of course, Professor Judith Phillips, who was on the advisory board for you, was also on the task force with me. So there was a way of drawing attention to some of the great work that you've enabled, not just around placemaking and creating new housing, but also how we adapt and improve our existing stock as well. So that was another important thing. That's perhaps something we can come back to during the course of the discussions later, if that's okay. So I see that Sally's ahead of the game, and she is helping me no end to make the next link to Kevin McGeo at Ebbsfleet Garden City, the development corporation there. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, he's been really inspirational and a figure behind the scenes who not only sort of talks HAPPI, he also judges HAPPI. And I'm sure he's going to reflect on that both in his professional background, but also his work he does in local communities, none more so at the Development Corporation, and how that impacts on that broader health agenda, but also that placemaking. So over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Jeremy. And again, I'd like to thank the HousingLIN for inviting me here today to share our lessons at Ebbsfleet. Prior to coming to Ebbsfleet, I was head of strategy for Homes England, and Jeremy headed up the Vulnerable Older People's Advisory Group there, who commissioned HAPPI, where I was the project manager. So it's amazing to see how the HousingLIN and Lord Best and others have kept HAPPI going all this time. And I'm very proud to be in the 101st happy hour. Today, really what I'm going to try and share with you is some of our lessons around planning HAPPI and planning for an aging population in a new place, although nowhere is completely new. And really thinking about planning for a whole new generation of new towns and how HAPPI might be part of that. I'm a self-confessed new town nerd. Grew up in a new town, and I know a lot of the problems and a lot of the positives of new towns. So it's incredibly exciting that this new government has put such an emphasis on reviewing the national planning policy framework, announcing a national task force to look at new towns again within their first 30 days. Probably an excitement not felt since the original Labour government back in 1945, who did the original New Towns Act. The welfare state was formed, and the Town and Country Planning Act, all within 2 years. But bearing in mind the New Town Act actually came before the other two, interestingly. But they very much recognised that health, housing and social care and everything had to come together in place. So Sally, if I could just move on the slides. What I was going to share with you today really is just a little bit about Ebbsfleet, our ambition. Some of you might not know it at all. So we're the first new town designated since Milton Keynes, the first garden city for 100 years. We're based on the around the international train station in Kent. So if any of you go to Paris, you'll see this train station with lots of car parking around it. That will be the new town of the future. But setting off on trying to do this new garden city for the 21st century, it was really important for us to understand lessons from the past. We're not starting in a vacuum. There are lots of lessons, good and bad, from other places that we should be taking forward. And then I'm just really going to share with you some of our healthy new town approach, because again, a lot of the things we were designated at the very beginning was one of the 10 healthy new town pilots, which has really helped shape our thinking, particularly around planning for an aging population. So if we just move on to the next slide. Ebbsfleet will be a town of about 35,000 people. It'll be completely brownfield between the towns of Dartford and Gravesham, just south of the River Thames. We'll have 7 city parks, which will be about nearly 50% of the area will remain green, many thousands of jobs, a new public transit network. And this is an image of some of the people who've moved, pioneers who've moved into the new town today. And the next slide, please. But, you know, as I said, we were set up as a development corporation in 2015 by George Osborne, very much because they couldn't quite understand why, having had an international train station here for already 12 years, no development was coming forward. The Guardian quoted us as having more press releases than homes built. And it was very much become a joke of government, really, why this new town in Kent wasn't taking place. I'm happy to say today that we're now the fastest growing place in England with over 750 homes per year. So things have changed. But in designing a new town for today, the 21st century, it's very different than our predecessors, and even in the post-war years. All of the homes here will be delivered by the private sector or housing associations, as opposed to many of the homes, maybe up to 50% in some of the earlier new towns, for public housing. So the people who will move to this new place, we don't know who they'll be. They're not moving here for a specific employer, as some of the new towns did. They're not here as overspill. We're not an overspill town. It's really people who can afford to move here and people who will be taking advantage of the affordable housing, 75% of which will be shared ownership. Shockingly, though, having come from Homes England and been involved in specialist housing for older people, I couldn't believe that of the 11,000 planning approvals that had been granted by Dartford and Gravesham before we arrived, none of which were built, none of them had any housing at all specifically designed for older people, nor was any of those 11,000 homes even going to be adaptable or accessible. The old lifetime homes are today M42 or 3. So we had to try and reinterpret what a garden city is in the 21st century. I'll come a little bit more onto that later, but it definitely included mixed tenure homes, housing types for everybody, and that everybody should be able and want to live in this new place. And it was really important for this new place for us to understand who was moving here, for us to plan for the facilities, to provide for the services, to provide for the health needs of that community in planning this place. Next slide, please, Sally. I'm moving on. So, as I said, as a new town nerd, I love to look back, to look forward. And there's so much to learn from the early new settlements in the UK. The UK really has led the world in terms of planning new settlements. I'm going back to one of the earliest new lanark in Scotland and Saltaire in Yorkshire. These were the first places almost in the UK where industrialist employers provided free healthcare, free education, free nursery facilities, and free homes, or not free homes that were part of their work, in these new communities. Now, although this is already in New Lanark in 1785, they hadn't specifically got retirement housing, bearing in mind the average life expectancy was around 40 years of age at that point in time. In Saltaire in 1851, they did provide 5% of all of the homes being almshouses for older people. Now, bearing in mind the people in Bradford, which is next to Saltaire, where the new workers were moving from, life expectancy was as low as 18 in 1851. It was almost the most unhealthy place in the country. So these new communities, these new workplaces, provided a really high quality of life for the new people that moved there. They also became very productive. Titus Salt, who built Saltaire, became the richest man in the UK. People who lived there living a better and healthier lives were actually more productive. And both of these sites are today UNESCO World Heritage Sites, meaning the best examples of planned new communities in the world. I'm moving on. They then formed the foundation, so yeah, the next slide. The foundation of the Garden City movement. And Ebbsfleet is a garden city, the first for 100 years. But the garden city movement was very much about trying to bring the best of the town and the country together. It was very much health focused. It was about quality of life focused. A lot of the housing built in Letchworth looks very familiar to today, but they were innovated in Ebbsfleet under Parkman Unwin housing models. Now, there wasn't a huge number of homes for older people in Letchworth in the early days, much because, again, the life expectancy was only 50 at this point in time. However, during the 1960s, many new homes were built for supported living. And today, a bungalow in Letchworth is about 50% more expensive than a typical two-bedroom house in the area because of the lack of accommodation planned in those early days. But the stewardship model for Letchworth continues today and is the foundation of what we're looking at in Ebbsfleet, a model run by people from people. So Letchworth was about a community-led place. And in turn, then that formed the foundation of the new towns. So if we just move on to the next slide. So the British new towns were one of the most exciting social experiments in the world, not just in the UK. 5% of UK population live in the new towns. Some of them are very well known, like Peterlee, other like Milton Keynes. Others are less well known, like Cumbernauld, Skelmersdale, and Peterlee. However, the new towns were very much focused on new families. People thought about, oh, they're coming there to work. New families were moving to the new towns. And very seldomly thought about the needs of an aging population. That then resulted in a whole plethora of extra care developments being built on the edge of Telford, Warrington, Milton Keynes, and other places in the early millennium because they hadn't really planned for that aging population at the beginning. Some of these facilities are fantastic, but they tend to be on the edge of town because there was no space for them in the original planned new town. So those are some of the lessons as we move on to Ebbsfleet. So if we just move on to what we did at Ebbsfleet, we were very lucky to be identified as one of the 10 Healthy New Town pilot schemes very early on in our foundation. These were NHS England led. We were the largest of the 10. And we worked as a collaboration across the Integrated Care Board, ourselves, Kent County Council and others to try and think about how we can develop healthier lives, healthier behaviours in this new place. We had a program called the Healthy Aging Program or the Aging Well in Ebbsfleet program, and that cut across the hardware, software, and hardware work streams. And I'm just going to run through a few examples of what they were. But what the whole focus of our new town was to try and put people in control of their own health, foster better, healthier behaviors, and give them the tools to actually make people have a higher quality of life and an active lifestyle in the place. So next slide. So just taking through the overview of the Aging Well in Ebbsfleet program, we as a development corporation adopted our own key performance indicator to report to government. We're sponsored by the Ministry of Housing to deliver up to 5% of specialist housing. We're relooking at those numbers, but the point is we know we have to intervene in the market to provide housing for these groups. We also commissioned the HousingLIN to help us understand need and demand. And we very much worked ourselves from our planning role to try and make sure most of the homes that we can deliver or support are at least adaptable and accessible. I'm going to look at these in a little bit more detail. So next slide, please. So just thinking about the hardware, that built environment. We had an international landscape design competition looking at how we design health into landscape. We were actually the commissioners of Building for a Healthy Life. There was a Building for Life before. We brought the healthy into it, which was then picked up by NHS England and Homes England, and has now been really instrumental in changing neighbourhood design. On the bottom right is one of our healthy neighbourhoods that's currently under construction. So we're very much looking from the home right across to the neighbourhood. Next slide. And in doing, sorry, back one, I think. We really needed to understand what kind of homes people wanted and needed. And that's why very early on, we commissioned the HousingLIN to use their shop model. And their shop model really looked not just in Ebbsfleet, but across Dartford, Gresham and the wider area as to what kind of housing people wanted in our area. They reported back that people wanted HAPPI style, right sizing homes. Particularly for people who were going to purchase their homes to give them a new option, not just in the affordable housing sector. This work has now informed the Dartford and Ebbsfleet housing needs assessment and will go on to inform the Gravesham local plan and the Dartford local plan moving forward. Next slide. The software is very much rethinking service delivery in our area. And again, with the Integrated Care Board and others, we've been really thinking about how we make a place that people live well in good health, more social prescribing, more well-being. It will manifest itself in a health and well-being hub at the centre of Ebbsfleet, which we're currently trying to develop with the ICB. But at the heart of that, and as part of that, we're looking at housing for key workers, housing with care, intergenerational housing as part of that solution. Next slide. We commissioned with Sir Wigglesworth Architects to look at what intergenerational housing meant. From our Aging Well in Ebbsfleet group, we knew we didn't want to be resulting in building care homes. We wanted people to have other options before they ended up in that care home scenario. So intergenerational housing, where we brought cross support for communities, for people, was the core of that. This diagram illustrates that what we recognize is that to create healthy places, we need to start with the people. You don't start with the housing product, you start with the people, you start with their lifestyles, with their lives. And then working with people over time, we'll understand their housing needs and we provide their housing needs at the end rather than trying to retrofit something from the beginning. I'm very much about nurturing the communities that we are working with. Next slide. So we've developed a whole range of community empowerment, community enablement tools. We give every home a free tree. We have 16 edible Ebbsfleet gardens. We have a vibrant cultural scene emerging in our area. We pay people for walking and cycling rather than taking their cars. And I'm going to share these slides in the future. These little links below will bring you to a series of films that, if you have time, I'll be really interested to look at what a vibrant community is like, what a healthy community is like, and what a good economy is. So next slide, please. We've now evolved that even further, where we have a resident community board that advise our board, and they themselves have developed their own action plan in partnership with Imperial College. That's all about connectedness. Busy people are healthy people. We all know from the blue zones and other things that if we can make people connected, happy, have networks of friendships, that's a better chance of being a healthier place. Next slide. And really, that's just an insight to some of the tools we've been using. There are many more that we could share with you. I'll also give a link to the lessons from the Healthy New Towns, which are bringing lessons from other healthy new towns as well, which you can look at. To date, we've about 30% of the homes built in Ebbsfleet. About 80% of them are adaptable and accessible now, bearing in mind there wouldn't have been any at the beginning. We've 3 schools built, another 2 in progress. We have a pub, we have 3 supermarkets, and we're beginning to see that vital infrastructure to sustain a community moving forward. As I said at the beginning, we're now building 750 homes a year, and we're the fastest growing place in England. And then the final slide, I believe. Most importantly, what do our residents think? I think incredibly for a new place where 50% of the people are moving from central London, over 80% of people feel they have a high quality of life. 86% of people feel there's a strong sense of community. And I think a lot of that has come from our Healthy New Town work and from that Aging Well and Ebbsfleet work, because we started thinking about if we design for people who are going to age well in place, we design for everyone. And this sense of creating community first is really paying dividends to what we've got. And I think the final one was just a slide, Sally, at the end, just giving you some links to some of our documents that we can share. The film version of what our residents are telling us it's like to live in this new town. So new towns of the future, and then we can just sort of stop sharing there. New towns of the future don't need to be sold as places. This idea of, new towns being Newtown Blues, which was effectively depression. People living in an isolated communities in a new place. But it is really important when we go into this new generation of new towns that we think of everybody, including an aging population. And I think if we design for people to age well in place, we'll design places that are successful for everyone. Thank you.
Well, Kevin, thank you. And I think that flowed really well from George's presentation. And there are several things that I take away. And I think one of the things you highlighted very early on was the economic impact that new towns have, both in terms of healthy living, in terms of productivity, enabling people to live well for longer, how to compress dependency, enable people to flourish and thrive. And I think that's something that I know that Task Force, the Older Persons Housing Task Force, was keen to explore as well. So examples about how the new town commission and perhaps the task force recommendations, when they're published, may also align quite neatly with the programme that you're developing and taking forward. And the other two things I think I took away was both the co-design as well as some of the sort of softer things that you're doing, which for me come from a language of social prescription, you know, which is about encouraging and enabling communities to really build that connectivity. So I'm sure we'll get some questions in the Q&A box going forward. So on that note, though, I'm going to ask Madeline to join us and talk about her programme, because again, I think issues around urban ageing and creating happy cities is something I'm really keen to explore, and how we might take off more in the UK context as well. So Madeline, good morning to you, and thanks very much for coming over online to the UK this afternoon here.
Thank you so much for having me. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Awesome. So yeah, a pleasure to be here. I feel like I've been doing a lot of presentations lately, but it's always a pleasure to spread my work across the ocean. So yeah, my name is Madeline. I'm a senior housing specialist at a small company called Happy Cities, and talk a little bit about where we're located in a bit. So I wanted to start by telling you a story of a project that we've been involved in here in Vancouver. So this is our urban village co-housing. It might not look like much from the corner, but it is actually a really important project. It has been a real petri dish of all kinds of experimental things that we've been testing out. So I don't know if you've heard, in North America, we talk a lot about the missing middle, and reflecting that we have a lot of single family homes. We have a lot of very high rise, very dense housing now in our cities, but we do tend to miss out on this typology of these small apartment buildings, townhomes, row houses, which you do have a lot more prevalently in the UK. So this project was really about a gentle densification of one of our neighborhoods here in Vancouver. It's also a Passive House certified building. So for those of you who don't know what Passive House is, it's a higher standard of energy efficiency, which also provides really great acoustics for the residents living in the building. And then the third kind of experimentation piece is we wanted to test a lot of these sociable design principles to understand, you know, does the way we design our buildings actually influence how people behave and how they socialize? And this project is co-housing light. So this is also another innovative piece about it. So in traditional co-housing, a group of residents come together and actually become the developers for themselves, and they develop their own housing. In this co-housing light model, they actually partnered with an established developer, recognizing that in Vancouver and British Columbia, it's pretty difficult to get a building permit. It takes a long time and a lot of expertise. And so the result was this project, which took a long time to finish. I'm happy to say that residents are actually living in it. And we had research grant money to do a long-term study of how residents would kind of settle into this model of living. So a little bit of the project. It has 12 units, and they're arranged around this small courtyard, a shared backyard. And the idea is that this was supposed to be a very social, intentional community with intergenerational population. So we have residents from a baby to all the way to someone in their 80s living in this building. And they come together and kind of manage the building together as a collective. They have several shared dinners a couple times a week. And they really are there to support each other. And what we're really talking about is an intentional community. And we found, you know, through all of our conversations with many folks in Canada, that this kind of intentionality is really key to building these relationships with our neighbors. And what co-housing communities are really trying to do is build this kind of mutual support. So you might be relying on your neighbors to help you age in place, even if you don't have family living in the city where you're aging. You might rely on your neighbors to watch your kids for 5 minutes or overnight when you need it. You might be sharing tools and resources. So in this particular building, people are sharing private vehicles, for example. And what we really see is that they have these very strong social connections right at their doorstep. So this is kind of the premise of all of the work that I've been doing at Happy Cities. is really starting to think about our homes as catalysts for social connection that can positively impact all different aspects of our daily lives. So got a little geography context. So the blue outline here is kind of my province, British Columbia. Interestingly, this is only 10% of Canada's total area, and you can see it overlaid over the UK. So Vancouver is way down here, but you can see how enormous our province is. A lot of it is forest. 90% of our population lives right around here, close to the US border. And this is our context, Metro Vancouver. So Vancouver is one of the cities in this region. It is the largest city in British Columbia, soon to be surpassed by Surrey. And, this is a very kind of complex geographical context. For a long time, our zoning has been largely allowing very high dense towers in some of our downtowns, but keeping most of our land area as single detached homes. And that is rapidly changing. So we've had a lot of pretty dramatic policy changes in the recent years. And there are a lot of questions around density. How are you going to live in these denser environments, particularly in the high towers? So our work is really around everything to do with happiness in cities. And my work focuses mainly on housing. So we do kind of planning and design. We do a lot of design audits, so we'll work with different developers to help them understand how their proposed community might impact well-being in the future. We also work on kind of policies and design guidelines with our local governments. We do a significant amount of kind of research, engagement, and post-occupancy evaluations, like we did with the Our Urban Village co-housing project that I showed you. And this is our Happy Homes Toolkit, which came out in 2017, and it really has been the launching pad for all of our housing work since then. And this is an interactive tool that you can use on our website. So Sally, I think, is going to pop the link in the in the chat. And yeah, as I said, this was really just the launch pad. So these are some of the reports we've released, I think, in the last 2 years. So we've been pretty busy. We work in partnership with one of the local universities here in Vancouver, Simon Fraser University, as well as a group called Hey Neighbor Collective, which is a collective impact project that is looking at building connections with between neighbors. So all of this to say, we've done kind of a broad range of research. A lot of it has been around age-friendly housing, and we've also done work around dementia, inclusive neighborhoods. The My Home, My Neighborhood research is specifically looking at the link between density and happiness, and a kind of a broad range of work. And just kind of the context that we're working in Canada. So these are kind of the latest stats that are coming out. 3 in 10 people are reporting feeling sometimes lonely, and 1 in 10 are feeling often lonely. So these are the latest survey data. So loneliness and social isolation are a rising challenge. And interestingly, in that project that I showed, our Urban Village co-housing, we surveyed them before and after moving in. So prior to moving in, about 60% of them reported feeling sometimes lonely, so about in line with the Canadian averages. And after 6 months after moving in, no one reported feeling lonely. So that was a pretty incredible transformation for those residents. And we now know kind of the serious health risks of this kind of loneliness crisis in our country. And as we think about, neighborly social interactions, we really think of a spectrum. So all of these types of social interactions are actually really good and protective for our health. Everything from a spontaneous encounter where you're just saying hi to your local, someone at the coffee shop or at the mailbox, all the way to this mutual support, which I was talking about with our urban village. So really, people are sharing cars, they're helping each other when they're sick. They really are, each other's safety net in a crisis. And what we talk about is the building design can enable those kind of encounters. So the way that we actually design our buildings and our neighborhoods help us actually see our neighbors. And if we don't see our neighbors, obviously we can't form relationships with them. But then we need to think about, some of the things that George was talking about, kind of the the hardware and software and all of the kind of programming that needs to happen to actually build those relationships. And to kind of add complexity to this, in our Canadian context, we are dealing with a huge housing affordability crisis, and we have a very low percentage of public housing here in Canada, much lower than the UK, and definitely much lower than other countries in Europe. So we are working very hard to kind of increase the supply of affordable housing, but working in a system that has not been working very well for many people, particularly renters and people with lower incomes. So what we're really talking about, if we cannot provide, affordable housing choices that provide secure tenure, it's incredibly difficult for people to form those roots and form those relationships, and kind of have a stake in their community. So I'll quickly take you through the kind of principles for social well-being. And these are from our latest publication, the Building Social Connections Toolbox. This is a document that was a culmination of many years of kind of work with partners in our region, so local governments, housing providers, and we did a considerable amount of research that went behind this, and this was published with, again, our partners, Hey Neighbor Collective. And really, this toolkit is for anyone interested in working in housing, community planning, or development, including planners and planning consultants, architects and designers, market and non-market housing developers, and all levels of government involved in housing. So you'll see kind of the toolkit is broken up into 4 sections. We talk about kind of the building edges, social circulation, social amenities, and social homes. So what we're really starting to think about is the entire building as a social ecosystem where these relationships are starting to form. And what we really are challenging planners and architects in our region to think about is, rather than checking a box to say, okay, I need to have, these features in my building, I'm going to have one social room in the building, and that's enough. Check, I've done my requirement. We're asking them to actually think about the outcomes for the people who are going to be living in that building. So rather than thinking of the building as something that you walk away from when the design is complete, it's something that will be evolving as people actually live in it and start to form these social relationships. So we've kind of come up with 6 principles, design principles to think about. And I'll go through them quickly. So location. This is really about maximizing the opportunity for those encounters and that interaction by thinking carefully about where we locate social features and spaces in convenient, visible, and prominent locations. So we see in a lot of our buildings, you'll have, a shared common room, but it's located in a really out of the way location, and actually no one uses it, which is not surprising because humans don't use spaces that they don't see every day. So it's really about appealing to our kind of our senses. And if there is, if you are walking by community every day, eventually you kind of start to want to participate in it. And we see this happening in a lot of our projects. So for example, a courtyard building is a great example of this. You'll have, the social spaces, the lobby, all kind of co-located together. People have to kind of walk through these exterior walkways to get to their unit. So they're kind of being exposed to community in their day-to-day. We also similarly talk about kind of mixed-use communities. So we have a lot of these kind of privately owned, publicly accessible spaces in Canada. They can be really great community hubs. And again, creating that sense of community right at people's doorstep. The next principle is invitation. So really maximizing these spontaneous daily encounters by designing spaces that help us want to pause and interact. So you can think about this as like, if you're walking down a very long, dark corridor, naturally you're gonna walk pretty fast. You're not gonna feel super comfortable. If someone stops to talk to you, you might kind of have to move aside, and you won't really have space to interact. So you'll kind of move on and go to your home. In contrast, if we think about this building frontage, where you have people interacting right at the front of the building, it's really inviting. There's lighting, there's landscaping. This is a place where you say, okay, I'm actually pretty comfortable here. If a neighbor approaches me to have a conversation, I'm likely going to stay a couple of minutes, maybe even take a seat, have a coffee there in the morning. The next principle is activation. So really creating interesting and functional spaces where people actually have a reason to use them. So this courtyard, I love this example. This is a project in the United States. And they've done an amazing job with this courtyard. So this is social housing for families. So you see here, this is the laundry room. So there's direct access between the laundry room and the courtyard. You've got kind of this informal play area with public art. You've got a community garden. You've got an indoor-outdoor connection to the courtyard. And you have these kind of opportunities to overlook between the private spaces and the courtyard. So there's a lot of reasons why, a family would want to spend time in this space. Inclusion, so this is something we think a lot about. How do these spaces feel for different people of different ages and abilities and backgrounds? So reflecting that Canada is a very multicultural country, reflecting on how people have cultural preferences and identities for interaction. So this is a seniors building. They've kind of brought in natural light into the corridors, added these safety railings, and also made it quite a bit wider. So it's a comfortable place to, if you're a senior who has mobility issues, you're taking a long time walking down this corridor, it's going to be a comfortable experience. They've also created this really nice little seating nook with a community notice board, some artwork. This is a wonderful place to read your newspaper, talk to your neighbors in the morning. Transition. So this is really about recognizing people's need to kind of retreat. So we aren't social 100% of the time, but actually having that choice of when and how you interact is critical for making people feel comfortable. So we can think about, how the edges of our buildings actually play out. So, for example, you might have a stoop with a little bit of privacy that gives you a transition zone to your home. And then thinking about, what does your unit feel like inside? Does it have good natural light, good acoustics? Can you hear your neighbors all the time? Because that can be a really a source of irritation and kind of make people feel overcrowded all the time and less likely to want to engage. And finally, evolution. So really thinking about those spaces as not a fixed entity in time, but something that is going to be evolving and is going to be taken by residents and made their own. So allowing those spaces to actually evolve. And this is where we work with a lot of housing operators to understand, okay, we know your policies are this, but what if we make room for people to actually modify the spaces and take ownership of them? So these are two of the spaces at a building in North Vancouver, which is the municipality across the water. They've got a really great approach. So right now they have a lot of young kids in the building. So they've used this room as a kids' activity room. It's messy. They close the door. The kids can do whatever they want in there within reason. Another thing that they really wanted was a workshop. So, that was something that a lot of residents felt strongly about. So a lot of them, when they moved, brought in their tools. They've created the shared workshop in their parking garage. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. And again, our toolkit has lots more background evidence and research, so please feel free to check that out.
Well, Madeleine, thanks very much for a really wonderful introduction to your work, but also I think how you've described what you're doing. A lot of that applies to the HAPPI principles that we're developing here and have developed over the years. The work that George has touched on in terms of that peoplehood, and I know the LIN is really keen to overlay some of this. We're looking at from a technology as well, so not just looking at physical communities, but virtual communities as well. So again, I'm sure there'll be continuing debate with you around that. But thanks very much for your presentation, and I hope people agree. There's three great presentations which all lead on from each other. We've got a couple of questions already in the Q&A box. If you are minded to send some others in, please do. We've got about 8-9 minutes before we draw this to a close. I know one's already been answered, and I haven't checked that one out, but I'm going to kick off with Janet. And in fact, I think both the questions I've got here on the screen, Madeleine, are for you, but I've also got some others for George and Kevin up my sleeve, so don't feel left out. The first one from Janet Sutherland, who's a long-term champion and a former co-chair of our London LIN region, is that was the co-housing scheme designed with future residents, or were the completed units sold to people who wanted co-housing? Are there many co-housing models in Vancouver? I think that's a great question, because I know Kevin and I visited a scheme, a brilliant Happy Design award-winning scheme that actually wasn't designed for older people, but has been occupied because it's the location, its content, what it offered. So any examples that you can give from the scheme that you described earlier about co-housing?
Yeah, so I would say co-housing is still very much a small minority of our housing in Canada. But why we've been studying is kind of this intentionality around aging in place. So, for example, the building I showed, they have a lift in the building, which they didn't need by code, but they put that intentionally for residents to be able to actually age. All of the units are designed to be easily adaptable. So if you need to add handrails or other accessibility features in your units, that can be quite easily done. And we're actually seeing a push in our provincial building code, which is basically which tells you exactly how you need to design buildings towards 100% adaptable units. So there are actually a lot of implications to this code change, but we are seeing a lot more push from funders towards having accessible and adaptable units, because Canada is very much an aging population. That being said, there are a lot of kind of gaps in our housing system. So we have a lot of older adults who are homeowners, for example. They don't necessarily have good options to move out of their homes. A lot of them are staying in these rather large properties for longer than they would need to, and risking kind of social isolation. So we're kind of, with this kind of push towards this gentle density and this missing middle, there's a lot of kind of ideas around how are we going to transform these houses into 4 units or 6 units, so that the older adult can age in place with close neighbors that are actually going to support them. And yeah, on our urban village co-housing, so co-housing, the residents are always kind of involved in the design. So this group actually had, because the design took so long because of our permitting process here, the residents had about 5 years where they were forming these relationships between them before they all became neighbors.
Yeah, it was interesting you're talking about sort of the length of time, because I think the first co-housing for seniors, if I can use your terminology, took 18 years to get off the ground, and it's now a very flourishing scheme. And Kevin, I think New Ground in Barnet won a HAPPI award many years ago as an example of that. George and Kevin, do you have any comments on the co-housing? And also perhaps linking in again with sort of issues around scalability, which touches on Judith's question as well. I think Judith's question has been for Madeline, but if I could introduce you to comment on those, and I'll come back to Madeline in a minute. George?
Kevin, go for it. You're about to go.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I'm very passionate about co-housing as well. And we know it's a wonderful part of the solution. It's always going to be a small part of the solution. We do have a Kent co-housing group that we've been trying to work with to try and find a site. We know it's just a win-win, isn't it? Because they're environmentally conscious, they want better quality, they really contribute to the neighborhood and the place. We just need to find them a site and sort of overcome some of those barriers to delivery, which some of the co-housing in the UK struggled with in the past. But I would really love to see it as part of our solution moving forward.
And we've got some authorities are putting co-housing in their supplementary planning guidance or in their plans as well. So we are seeing that move forward. George, any thoughts?
Well, I think it would be the placemaking thing. So it goes beyond the actual co-housing to just think about it, and recognizing that winters in Canada are slightly different from winters in this country, and also recognizing that there are others actually in the audience who have more experience, but lovely to see that immediate community. Also, actually, what's the context where that comes in? I mean, Kevin's work will be there. So where's the local retail? How accessible is that? Where are the other amenities that people want to get to? And I think it has great potential when it's part of a broader place agenda that keeps people in communities. Something that actually I've just seen her name up there, Elena Negbu, who leads the older persons group up in Greater Manchester, done some wonderful work with the people in Old Moat, making that a more livable community. So it's scalable, I think, in the context of which you make the whole community something that people want to be in.
That's right. And in fact, we've got a stellar cast of participants as well as speakers. I've just noticed. We've got Judith Phillip, Professor Judith Phillip, who actually was very much part of that Deshkar project, George, you referred to earlier. And that, I mean, bearing in mind the climate point you made around Canada, a lot of that drew attention to the Nordics and the Scandinavian design principles as well. And Judith asked issues around how does this apply itself across non-urban spaces, for example, smaller village contexts. And I'm also noted that the chair of the Older Persons Housing Task Force has put a question in as well. What do you wish you could have achieved? And I think this is for everybody, but has not been possible, and why? So other things, you know, you felt that have perhaps dropped off, or you would have liked to have seen in the frame. So if I kick off with George first, then I'll come to Kevin, and I'll conclude with Madeline.
I think we had a missed opportunity for reasons that we understand to combine the sort of housing design piece with the modern methods of construction, and build, you know, connect two big agendas that were being pushed. But so that's one, you know, small missed opportunity.
Kevin, any thoughts?
Yeah, because I haven't given up on anything yet. So I'm still hoping all the things I was hoping for we can achieve, but some of them have been more challenging than others. Alison asked him a question in the Q&A, were we getting 100% adaptable and accessible? We're not at 100% yet. I do think number one thing we should be doing is 100% of all new homes should be adaptable and accessible so people can age well in place. So I want to get there. I guess our biggest challenge, and again, I haven't given up on it, so I'm still hoping for it, is to deliver our health and wellbeing hub with a community of intergenerational housing, and including the step up, step down, transitional housing, and housing for key workers. HousingLIN did do a study for us which showed that we could make £7 million per annum savings to UK PLC if we put health, housing, and social care together. However, we're still in that position that housing's one budget and social care is another, and you know, the health board's another. I really hope we can break down those barriers and actually deliver a benchmark project that is one of the best in the world to really showcase that. And I think those savings are really, really important. And I think HousingLIN's support in showing that's important. It makes a stronger business case. It's a little bit more work sometimes, and it's a little bit more ambitious, but I think it'll be worthwhile. So I haven't given up on it, but I do recognize it's a bigger challenge than even we realized when we set out to do it.
So Madeline, the challenge is to not only have intergenerational communities that are happy, but also integrated communities, you know, to try and break down those silos. If I give you the final word then on some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a key part of the work that we've been doing is let's have architects and planners and you know, funders sitting down at the same table and actually having these conversations. And you know, it's always shocking that those conversations aren't happening, but also on the positive side, how much can actually be accomplished when you get people into the same room and thinking about things differently. So that's the change that I'm hoping to see in Canada, is really, we are in a housing crisis, and there is this big push to say, you know, we need to build so many units right now, but at the same time, we need to be like, okay, but let's make sure that we are building, you know, sustainable, resilient communities that are actually going to be serving people's health and happiness for the next 50, hopefully longer years, because we don't build for very long term here. But yeah, I hope that we can get ourselves out of kind of this crisis mode, and really start looking at building quality places for people.
Well, thank you, all three of you. And I think the messages that we've heard today really sort of resonate with me in terms of some of the things that we really sort of concentrated down and dug down in as part of the Older Persons Housing Task Force. And I'm very hopeful that our chair and the task force members will continue to advocate and champion the issues around accessible, affordable and adaptable home, and build in that climate resilience to enable people to have a broad range of choices in terms of in later living, as well as making sure that people who are in early careers and an early life can look forward to a healthier life as well in terms of the homes and communities they are. We have a budget next week, so it's a big day for knowing whether there's going to be more capital and revenue investment in our economy. But also, we're really keen to hear from members about their experience as well and share those. Next week, we're moving on from this topic to another topic, which is very much around thinking about the Trusted Assessor Scheme and how to ensure local authorities working with local residents can be better informed about the type of accessible, adaptable homes that are available. I know Sheena, who's one of our guest speakers next week, has listened in this afternoon, so please do join us. But that just leaves me to say a big thank you to all our speakers. Can I thank all the contributors who've posted questions and listened carefully to the words of wisdom that we've been able to share with you this afternoon, or in Madeline's case this morning. Can I invite you to join us at future happy hours, and can I also thank the team behind the scenes, Sally and colleagues, for making this event possible. The session will finish quite abruptly, but there should be a little pop-up which asks you to give your feedback. We really value that, because we will share that along with the slides and the presentation and the chat links that we've posted during the course of today's session in our upcoming email to everybody who's registered for today's session. But that's all from me. Thank you very much, and I hope you've learned and watched and listened as much as I have. A really tremendous session. Happy 101.
Good. Lovely.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.